Data privacy is an interesting issue and something we've got to figure out. However, that said, AI I do not think is a big threat to data privacy because it's not looking at individuals. It's looking at large patterns across the data, right? And so there's ways to anonymize these medical records, give it just the data points. It doesn't have to give name and birth date and, personal information. And even if that is used to train an AI model, that's not the data point you would get out at the end, right? There's nothing identifiable about that. If I have an AI that can identify a cyclist for a driving car, there's no way to go back and figure out what individual riding a bike trained that model and expose their identity from that, right?
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
Hi there, everybody. This is Mark Verbenkov, and welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. This is episode number 154. And today we are going to be revisiting one of my favorite topics, mostly because I know a little bit less about it than, say, like artificial intelligence or the future of work. So it's always a great pleasure for me to have on knowledgeable guests to share their insights into what they're doing, into how they see their industry. And of course, this is going to be about biotechnology. I think biotechnology, perhaps more than many other topics on the podcast, is going to be one of the most important fields that's going to be shaping, of course, the future of human health, but also other things like agriculture and sustainability, and a number of other things that occasionally gets brought up on the podcast. But today's episode is going to be focusing on the future of human health. So, we talk about biotechnology as this general term, but I think most of you are aware that it's, relevant for developing life-saving drugs, to advancing personalized medicine, which is something that is talked about a number of times on the podcast. I find it absolutely fascinating. We do get into it today. To also, creating sustainable solutions for our planet, which I think is touched on in the All In podcast quite often. So it's kind of a place where, science meets technology, and there's a lot of potential for unlocking a lot of understanding and capabilities and kind of really interesting, unimaginable things that I don't think many people were even thinking about just a few decades ago. So that's why it's always great to have a guest come onto the podcast to talk about this. So in today's episode, we kind of take a dive into this rapidly evolving world, and we focus specifically on the transformative power of something called next generation sequencing and how artificial intelligence is, or at least part of it, how artificial intelligence is being integrated into this. And these advancements are not really just pushing the boundaries of what's possible in diagnostics, but also for personalized medicine. And they're also setting the stage for a new era in how we understand and, of course, treat genetic disorders, which we touch on today. So we'll explore, of course, the latest trends, the challenges that still need to be overcome, and the profound impact that these technologies are having on both research and patient care. We'll also look ahead into the future, which is, of course, one of my favorite things to do on this podcast and in general, and discuss how bioinformatics is set to play quite an important role in healthcare over the next decade. And then, of course, whether you're passionate about biotech or simply curious about the future of medicine, this podcast is packed with insights that highlight why biotechnology is so crucial in our world of today, but also for tomorrow. So my guest today is Dr. Jonathon Hill. He is the VP of Science and Technology and a co-founder of Wasatch Biolabs, where he leads research and development of proprietary nanopore sequencing-based technologies with Dr. Timothy Jenkins, the VP of Research and Discovery, and of course, a co-founder. He is an associate professor of cell biology and Physiology at Brigham Young University, with 18 years of experience with genetic and epigenetic research. His research lab combines bench biology with bioinformatics and genomic approaches to assemble and determine the underlying mechanics of gene regulatory networks. Now, on a personal note, I find this conversation absolutely interesting, but also a little bit more interesting to understand. I think Jonathon is really great at breaking down complex ideas into easier to digest bits and points that I think he does a great job on the podcast. For somebody who's not well versed in biotech or any of the jargon, personally, I think the episode, the discussion itself is pretty, maybe not super easy to understand, because we do still, of course, talk about interesting ideas that are maybe a little bit more beyond the average, day-to-day conversation. But even if you're coming at it from a general level, it's still a very easily approachable subject. And I think Jonathon does a great job of that. So hopefully you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. And without any further ado, I'll bring on Jonathon. Great. Well, thank you, Jonathon, for joining me on the podcast today. It's great to have you on the podcast to talk about, I guess we can generally say, biotech. It's been a while. Obviously, there's been a lot of AI news, so podcasts have been focusing on AI a little bit, but I really like having guests to talk about these type of topics. So it's great to have you on, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about biotech and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. I love talking about biotech, and as someone that grew up in the Silicon Valley, I really think biotech is tech.
Yes.
It's all the same. We're all one field, and we're all trying to, help humanity by inventing new things. So it'll be fun to talk to you.
Right. So you're focused more on the diagnostics side of things. But I think before we get into that, could you kind of give the audience a little bit of a clue as to what initially draw you into the field and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think about that and what drew me in, and really it was kind of, I don't know, death by a thousand cuts kind of thing. It was a slow process over time coming into this field. Just a little background on myself. I was pre-med as an undergraduate student. Really, when I look back, my motivations were that I wanted to have a career where I could benefit people and help people. And I was good at science in school. And so everybody said, you're a doctor, then that's how that's done, right?
Right.
But when I was an undergrad, there was a couple key moments. One was my junior year, I was actually TAing the genetics class at BYU, where I did my undergrad and where I'm a professor now. And I was doing research in a lab. And I just thought, wow, I really like this work. And I can see the impact that the research itself can have on people's lives, right? And how teaching people can have an obvious impact on people's lives. I want to do this. So I kind of suddenly switched. I was already signed up for the MCAT and everything, but I switched my career path and decided to go to graduate school. And then, I kind of just jumped in and thought, okay, I'm going to do research. But then as I got into that research through graduate school and my postdoctoral fellowship and then becoming a professor, I kind of saw something that bothered me. And it was that I didn't know if my research was actually benefiting anyone, to be frank about it.
Sure.
I would publish a paper. I don't know if many people were reading it. Sometimes in those papers, I'd say, hey, this could have potential impacts in healthcare or something in this way. But of course, nothing was getting translated to the marketplace, to the healthcare field. And I started thinking, if I really want to have an impact on people's lives, I'm going to have to be part of this solution to help bring that research from the lab out into the marketplace, into everyday lives, and be able to help people that way. And so, my first kind of foray in the area was with a student who came to me. He said, I have a great idea for a new scientific technique. It was a CRISPR-based technology. For those unfamiliar, CRISPR won the Nobel Prize recently. It's a big technology where we can edit genes, right? And he had a new kind of way to use that in a research lab. And we started going down that path and realized that if we wanted people to use this, we had to create a company and take it out there. And when I was kind of doing that, I started thinking more about how can I do this consistently? How can I make sure that this transition occurs? And then actually I was approached by someone else, and the motivation really centered around early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
We're starting to see these drugs be FDA approved, come onto the market, that can slow the progression of Alzheimer's. However, neurons, when they die, never come back. There's no way to recover that. And so the missing link was that there was no way to diagnose Alzheimer's pre-symptomatically, so that you can maybe start the drug early enough that where you would never have symptoms, right? And so they had an idea on how to do this, and came to me and said, hey, we know you're interested in this kind of translational research, getting things out into public. I also had some skill sets with DNA sequencing technologies that helped address some of their technical issues they were running into. And they said, hey, you want to come start this company with us? And so that's what we did, and got pulled in. And I've never been this involved with a company before. And it's been really fun to see kind of the challenges that come up that we don't think about in academia. We have blind spots in academia.
Sure.
And to see that side of things, and to see how to address things, and to see what we really need to do to be able to get this out there into the marketplace.
Interesting. Well, I'm really looking forward into diving into that a little bit as well. I mean, I started a company just under a year ago as well, and moving from kind of an employee, like a consultant, employee mindset to founder, and trying to do all these, like, just the ridiculous amount of things that you have to do in order to have a business function. It's mind opening, right? It really opens up your mind and eyes to I guess how reality works a little bit more.
It really is. And there's things that I see that I'm like, I never even thought about that. Like, I didn't know that existed as an issue to resolve, or I'd seen it and always wondered, why do people do it that way? And now I understand why they do it that way.
Right. Yeah.
So it's good.
Well, so your company is, if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Wasatch Biolabs.
Yes, Wasatch.
Okay.
It's a Native American word. It's the name of the mountain range in Utah where all the ski resorts are.
Okay.
And so kind of behind Salt Lake and Provo, that mountain range is the Wasatch Mountains.
Okay, nice. I'm from Canada, so I'm not too familiar with.
Yeah, most people don't know the names. They just, they're part of the Rocky Mountains, and that's all they know.
Right. Great. So I definitely want to touch on what you guys are doing a little bit later on, but I think for biotech in particular, it's a little bit esoteric to a lot of people, and especially to like audience members of this podcast. As we mentioned before the recording, artificial intelligence is on everybody's top of mind right now. So maybe we could take a step back before diving into everything.
Great.
So we're talking today about sequencing and how that's related to diagnostics. So maybe we could just lay the groundwork and how that's relevant before we cut into the next generation sequencing, which I think will be the main focus.
Okay. Yeah. So the key here is, well, first of all, I think that's an important thing to do. Biotech is an amazingly broad umbrella term, right? That can involve anything from engineering bacteria and fungi to grow proteins for us that we can use in our food products, to the kind of diagnostics that we're talking about. And it's a very loose term that we use that, anytime it involves biology and technology, we just throw it out there. In the case, what we're talking about really is DNA sequencing. Now, we're all aware that we have DNA, right? And that it's made up of 4 bases abbreviated by A, T, C, and G. And the sequence of those DNA bases, the A, T, C's, and G's, the letters of the genome throughout your DNA dictate everything about your life, right? What you look like, how you formed as an embryo, what diseases you're susceptible to, how you react to certain foods, everything there is encoded in it, right? I think back to the Jurassic Park Mr. DNA kind of explanation that I think most of us are familiar with. But what we're learning now is how powerful looking at those DNA sequences, and we'll talk about on top of that certain chemical modifications that are made to those sequences and what they can tell us about disease, and really help inform us as important data points as we get into things.
Yeah. So this has been going on, maybe also a little bit of context about the time horizon here, because I think it's, or the timeline. I think it's always interesting when, we're talking about kind of state of the art technology that's being applied today, but to kind of put things into context, right? So this hasn't been around for 100 years.
It has
It's,
not, no.
and I think it's, especially because if you believe we're living in the exponential age of technology, to put things into a bit of context to understand how far things have come, and then maybe get a sense of how quickly things are going to progress in the next, I used to say 10 years, but I mean that's a lifetime away now, so maybe 3 to 5
Yes.
years is a better time horizon to look at. Could you give a little bit of the, maybe not like the full history, but like a bit of a sense of the time horizon that we're looking at?
Yeah, looking back, this is very, very new technology, relatively speaking. Believe it or not, the idea of a personal computer is old compared
Sure,
to DNA
sure.
sequencing. Okay. The first human genome, the first genomes, meaning the entire DNA sequences of a species, started coming out for bacteria, things that have small DNA coding sets, in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
The human genome was sequenced and published for the first time in around the year 2000. A couple different dates depending on when you call it finished, kind of
Sure,
thing.
sure.
But around the year 2000 is when we're getting our first copy. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars to do that one single DNA sequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the ensuing years, we have actually followed Moore's law as far as costs and ability to get DNA sequencing done. And so the prices have been dropping precipitously. The amount of DNA sequencing that has been done and put into public repositories or used in research has grown exponentially from that time. Now, just 24 years later, I can sequence an entire human genome for less than $1,000 in about 72 hours, right?
Crazy.
And
Yeah.
so that's where we're at right now. And it's kind of a fundamental shift right now where that technology is getting to the point where this is going to be a regular part of medicine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Used to be, well, we had one copy, we could kind of use as a reference. Then it got to be, well, in certain research cases where we have clinical trials or something, we might collect 10 or 12 genomes over the space of a couple of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was thought for a long time that we would never get to the point where we could just sequence everybody's genome, right? And we're not quite there. We don't have the infrastructure and everything to be able to do everybody's, but we're getting really close.
Mm.
And the cost, less than $1,000, your genome doesn't change. So you only have to do it once in your life. That is
Right.
not cost prohibitive anymore. And I think that's reflected in the fact that you have these companies that will do DNA sequencing for you. Send them a swab from your mouth, send it off. They're not doing the entire set of DNA. They're doing select parts
Mm.
to find your ancestry or whatever else they're trying to do. But they'll do it for a couple $100s. And it's just entering the mainstream at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And so it's something that I think everybody has to come around to and realize that likely in their lifetime, it's going to become part of their health record, their entire genome sequence. And the doctors will be using that information to help diagnose disease and create treatment plans for them.
Yeah. And I guess this is one, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm of course speaking out of my my bubble of knowledge here, my wheelhouse. But this seems to be one of the main tools that's kind of moving medicine and healthcare from kind of like a general prescriptive, well, humans act like this and humans have these problems, to a much more focused and I guess personalized medicine is the term here, where it's like, well, this is relevant for you and you need to take this drug or take this diagnostic test, or because your DNA has these markers for this, Alzheimer's or whatever it is that we're talking about. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this shift in well, from general to personal. It's more prescriptive, right? So you're able to see things before they're happening, and then of course get a little bit more better healthcare. The goal is, anyways, as I see it.
That's the goal. I think as we do this, one thing we're realizing is we are not all the same. A lot of research has been done in lab rats, lab mice, that are inbred and almost genetically identical across the population, right? And humans are not that. And so you're right on. What we're trying to do is realize what are the kind of subgroups within a population that respond differently to treatments or have different susceptibilities to disease, et cetera, and tailor the treatments to those individuals. I think nowhere is this seen more than in cancer right now. Cancer treatments have always had this plague where they would come out with this new drug and it would work, say, 80% of the time, but 20% of cancers just would not respond at all to this drug. And it used to be they just tried and hopefully you got lucky and it worked on yours, right? Now they're starting to say, oh, if there's mutations in this particular gene within your cancer tumor, tumors get a lot of mutations built up in them, then you're not going to respond. And we need to try this other treatment, right? And they're starting to map those out and be able to identify those. Now, it's been an interesting discussion in the field. When I did my PhD, I worked in stem cell treatments. And at the time, they kept saying, oh, we'll just take your own cells and make a new pancreas for you and then replace it, right? And as they've looked into the economics of that, you actually do run into an issue if you try to do it that personalized,
right,
one per one, because it becomes cost prohibitive to do so. But there is this kind of middle ground where you can maybe have 3 or 4 cancer treatments for a particular type of cancer, for example, and tailor the drug cocktail to a particular individual. So now, the manufacturing, you still got the economies of scale. You've got all these things to kind of help with that and justify the cost of it. But at the same time, you are tailoring things the best you can to individuals.
And then I would assume as we're getting economies of scale and as technology is just becoming cheaper, at some point in the distant future, who knows how long, it might be feasible to do this one-to-one, highly personalized, highly individualized, testing, healthcare, et cetera.
Yeah, in some cases, yes. For example, I do think we will reach a stage where at least people with certain diseases in their family or something will have their genome, right? Almost everybody will have their genome in their health record. And that will be truly one-to-one. Drugs are a little trickier because you have to test their safety and efficacy on groups of individuals. So I don't know if that one will ever get truly one-to-one kind of personal level, but it will be a lot better than it is now. And as a result, our healthcare will be much more efficient.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Well, I guess now we have a bit of context. So what is it that you guys are doing? And I think the term is next generation sequencing. And why is that important for the work that you're doing?
Yeah, first introduce the kind of generation thing, which I don't like the names. But anyway, first generation sequencing was old-fashioned kinds, how the first genome was done for a large part. Although during kind of the later stages of that, they started to generate more high throughput sequencing methods, being able to read the DNA faster and more at a time. And they called that next generation sequencing. And I disliked that because obviously there was going to be another next. So were we going to call that next or something like that, right? We ended up calling it third generation sequencing. So we're actually on third generation sequencing technologies right now. And Wasatch Biolabs, that's what we're working in, is the third generation sequencing. So the first generation just allowed us to sequence DNA. We could do it. Second generation made that high throughput, more cost effective. And then what third generation has done is made the sequencing data that we get longer, and so therefore more complete, and then allows us to look at chemical modifications on the DNA. And if I can branch into that a little bit right now.
Yeah, please.
The chemical modification is an interesting thing that we've learned along the way. First of all, when we got the first human genome, they actually declared at the time that we would understand every disease. They said, it's all in our DNA. We will understand it all. And actually what we figured out is a lot of our disease has no correlation with our DNA sequence whatsoever. It's been a very interesting kind of wake-up call within the field because we thought this was all genetic. For example, I've done research. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that. Is it like environmental, or is it random, or like is there an answer to that?
Yeah, so that's where I'm going next.
Yeah, okay.
But to give an example, You can see a heart on the wall behind me. Here, I do a lot of research in congenital heart defects. Okay. And we thought they were all genetic. But what we found was that when we did the DNA sequencing, it only explains 20 to 30% of those congenital heart defects.
Wow.
So you're right on. The question then becomes, well, then what is it?
Yeah.
Right? And it is complicated. Some of them are purely environmental. The environment is affecting proteins and function in our body in some way that is outside of the genetics and causing some sort of disease. Some of them create these complex interactions with the disease. There was a researcher at the U of U who did a really interesting study. Unfortunately, I don't know if it ever got published, but they looked at a family that part of the family lived in urban Utah and part of the family lived in rural Idaho. And the rural Idaho family had a lot of children being born with congenital heart defects, but the urban Utah family did not. And so they did DNA sequencing and they looked at it. And initially they said, well, we can't find anything that predicts, there's not a mutation that exists in the Idaho branch of the family and not the Utah one. But then they looked deeper and they realized that there was a genetic mutation in the family, in both branches of the family, that caused them to be susceptible to an environmental factor that they were exposed to in rural Idaho, like a farm chemical or something, that the Utah ones were not exposed to, right? So there was a genetic component, but we initially missed it because there was also an environmental component on top of that. And so that makes it very complex. And we're going to need lots of big data and AI models and all kinds of stuff to start parsing out those kinds of interactions. And then the last piece we found is that your DNA sequence does not change throughout your body. With a couple of exceptions, the DNA sequence in any cell in your body is identical to any other cell in your body, okay? But each cell, as it's becoming its own unique identity as the embryo is forming, makes chemical changes called methylations to certain parts of their DNA. And that is unique at different time points of life. It's unique in different cell types. It's unique in different disease states. So it's kind of the changing part of our DNA. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And what we're finding is sometimes these chemical modifications of the DNA are actually involved in the DNA, not the DNA sequence itself, just the modifications. And only with third-gen sequencing can we start actually looking at those modifications directly and measuring those and measuring their association with disease.
Very interesting. Well, I mean, from my brief foray before the podcast into this, it sounds like, and from what you're saying here, there's just layers of complexity that make it a little bit more challenging for, I guess, just the occasional research team to figure these things out. And now, as you mentioned, you need to start utilizing some other tools. One of my favorite terms is to become a centaur, right? So you and artificial intelligence blended together in order to get the work done.
Yes.
So I mean, maybe it is a perfect time to bring that up. It was certainly something I wanted to touch on in the podcast today. Can we dive into AI and how it is
for sure
facilitating or solving this complexity issue that you've brought up?
Yeah, I mean, first, just kind of umbrella, I think AI is a hugely important tool in the biology space, right? One of my favorite quotes is that biology is not rocket science. It's far more complicated. And the idea there is that biology in its very nature is very interconnected with multiple variables. And it's really hard to isolate one variable and affect it without changing everything.
Sure.
Right? Yeah, it's like a spider's web. You move one part and the whole thing changes. And that makes it very, very hard to study in our kind of traditional way of doing things. But at the same time, this is exactly what AI is great at taking large amounts of input data, which we can now generate. That was also a limitation in the past, but now we've got it, and find complex patterns within that data and make sense of those complex patterns, right? And so this is, I think we're in the very early stages of figuring out how to use AI effectively to answer some of these questions. And part of that is that we as scientists just aren't trained to get the data correctly.
Right.
We're not used to the numbers you need, the amounts of data. We're not used to controlling the noise variables appropriately. These kinds of things to build good AI models that are kind of subtle and take time to build kind of an instinctual perception of is hard for us as researchers. We're used to, very hands-on measurements and focusing on precision on a few samples rather than accepting a little more noise and just getting tons of data.
Right.
Kind of thing. So it's an adjustment for us. And I think we're going to learn a lot. There are cases I think AI is being used right now where we'll find it's not necessary or very useful. We've seen that in some of our own research, that once you focus on the data generation, sometimes the signal pops out so strongly that you're like, oh, I actually don't need an AI model for it.
Okay.
I just had to look in the right place. But others, it's going to be fundamental for parsing out these because they're far too complex of patterns for us to ever see ourselves.
Have there been any success cases so far where AI has been applied and found, something interesting that would help a diagnosis? I'm also thinking of the last year or so where we've been getting, or maybe 2 or 3 years, where we've been getting these pretty large news waves of AlphaFold, or I think it was Google Gnome that generated or created, I can't remember the right term, 2.2 new metamaterials and things like that are now being used in the lab. So I think at the forefront of people's minds who are paying attention to this, it's okay, there's clear cases where AI has helped solve problems, generate some new materials or new interesting things. Is it still too early in your field, or has there already been some cases where this has already been successful?
I mean, I think in a sense we are too early. A couple things about the healthcare field. Often a software company will put out a program knowing there's issues, but they can kind of fix it along the way, right? We don't do that in medicine and healthcare.
Why not?
It's got to be, yeah. But yeah, we're not going to beta test it on the public, right? That's not good. When we do get rushed, then it becomes bad and it hurts public perception, et cetera. So we got to get this right. So that I would say I'm aware of some uses that are being used, but I don't know if we have one that's made it all the way through the regulatory approvals to the end. AlphaFold is a great one. We're starting to use it in the lab on certain projects to help predict what our artificial proteins that we're making will look like, things like that. So it's a great tool. There's a company I'm aware of that is using AI image analysis to quickly screen cancer therapeutics. And I believe they have 3 drugs that are in clinical trials now that came out of that, right? And so we're still on the path. We don't have a drug that's out and was successful from that, but it is being used, and it's being used for what it's really good at. I'm going to look at 100,000 images and find patterns with these images and help design a drug from that kind of thing. There's also subtle ways under the hood. So we talked about how my company uses 3rd generation sequencing in a diagnosis context. Many of our diagnostics, we found we don't need AI models. The signal is strong once we know where to look for it. But the base calling, when it's deciding if it's an A, T, C, or G in that particular piece of the DNA, is all a AI model that's doing that, taking the signal off the machine and interpreting that to decipher what the DNA sequence was that went through the machine. And so even if we're not using it directly, it's still a fundamental part of what we're doing in our analyses.
Right. Yeah.
So
it's getting integrated, much like I guess most software nowadays, right? Whether it's Copilot or you just have to open up any new software and there's an AI integrated into it, whether it's useful or not. That seems to be where we're going.
Right.
Could you touch on exactly what you guys are doing with the 3rd generation and the diagnosis? I mean, you brought up Alzheimer's at the beginning, for instance. So maybe just a tangible use case or something that the audience and myself can kind of get to grips with, understand a little bit more tangibly.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it's kind of a new way of looking at things, mainly because we didn't have the technology to look at these things before.
Mm-hmm.
And I should preface this saying that all of these are still in the works under
Sure,
research, right?
sure.
None of them are released yet. But the data right now is looking very promising as we go through it. But the basic idea is that in many diseases, you have cells that are dying, okay? Neurodegeneration, even autoimmune diseases, a number of different cases, right? And so let's just use the example of Alzheimer's to run with that one. In Alzheimer's, cortical neurons are dying because of plaque buildups and all these kind of pathologies. Past attempts to diagnose Alzheimer's have been based on recognizing the proteins and stuff that are causing the cell death. The problem is they're really hard to detect and get to. And we said, well, let's take a different way. Let's take the DNA from those dying cells, which gets spilled into your blood. So it's just floating around. It's called cell-free DNA because it's just naked DNA floating around in your blood from a cell that had died. And let's look at those chemical modifications to the DNA that only show up in cortical neurons. They're not found anywhere else in the body. And if we can find that in the blood, we know we have neurons dying. And now we have a publication out showing kind of the first pass analysis of this. And even in that one, we showed that there was a large difference between an individual that was healthy, that didn't have Alzheimer's, versus one that did, in the amount of neuron-derived DNA that we could detect in their blood. And so we're using as what we call a biomarker, right? Some sign that there's disease. And in this case, it's saying, well, if cells are dying, we're going to find that cell's DNA in the blood. And if we can identify that DNA as coming from that particular cell type, we can diagnose the disease. So that's one particular use that we're really focused on right now that requires this kind of chemical modification sequencing that we couldn't do ever before.
And so you alluded to this at the beginning about getting people that are going to have Alzheimer's or in the early process of having it, getting them a drug and then being able to delay the impacts of it. Could you give some kind of like numerical amount to the delay? Like, are we talking about increasing somebody's lifestyle by 1 year, 5 years, depending on how early or maybe the better question is how early is early and then how many years can somebody's quality of life be increased?
So this is still very much in the works, right? We're still figuring this out.
Yes.
And part of that is the drugs are brand new too. And so we don't really have a good idea of how much longer they can prolong somebody's lifespan. Some of the data from those clinical trials are saying, 5-6 years longer kind of thing. In our trials and in the published data, we went as early as 5 years before the onset of Alzheimer's in our patients. And we were already able to detect it 5 years before onset.
Wow. Okay.
And so you can imagine, and we haven't tested this yet, but you can imagine how if you can catch them at that point, 5 years before they have symptoms, and then double or triple the amount of time it takes for them to get there. Now you're talking 10, 15 years, and you're already talking about someone who's 65, 70 years old. And so the hope, and some of our partners have reflected this hope, is that as these drugs improve, we could get to a point where essentially you never have symptoms. Right? Something else is going to get you before the symptoms do, kind of thing. And that would be a huge boost to people's kind of quality of life.
That's okay. One, fabulous. Two, super interesting because it's failing with the language here, but it's almost like a cheat code or a loophole where you don't have to cure the disease, but you're curing the symptoms. So therefore, you're kind of curing the disease, right? Okay, fascinating. Is this something more to a general point, but is this something that we're going to be seeing more and more of with these type of diagnostic tools? We're able to cheat the disease in a way and either prolong so that you don't get the symptoms, or it's a cure but it's not a cure.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of latter part about kind of cheating the symptoms long enough
Yeah.
Will depend disease by disease,
Yeah.
right? And use case by use case. For example, if we just, well, there are drugs out now that will delay the onset of type 1 diabetes in children, right? And that's a great thing, but eventually they will get type 1 diabetes because they're young when they start, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's going to vary widely on what happens here. But I do think the key is that we need, frankly, a paradigm shift in our medical care that emphasizes good diagnostics up front. Okay. Firstly, because our current system is wasteful and expensive. Okay. I've told this on a few podcasts, but I think it's a good story. It's a very personal story kind of thing. But I went to the doctor and I had kind of an athlete's foot infection that wouldn't go away, right? All the tough actin, tinactin, and all that kind of stuff wasn't helping. And so I went to the dermatologist and he looks at my feet and he goes, "Why don't you try this cream?" Right. 2 weeks later, nothing's different. I go back. He goes, "Huh, I thought that would work. Let's try this other cream." Right. 2 weeks later, I come back. I'm using his time. I'm paying co-pays, right? The insurance is paying fees, all this kind of stuff. Finally, on the third visit, he goes, "Well, I'm really stuck." And he takes some scrapings off my foot, goes to a microscope in the back and looks at it and comes back and goes, "I know exactly what you have. Here's what you need." And my first thought is, why did you not do that on the first visit? That was so easy and so fast. And yet that's kind of a simple, silly, non-high stakes example, but it's throughout our healthcare system, where it's a try and then try again kind of model. And we got to move to a point where the first step is to say, let's do this test, figure out what you have, and then do the treatment. And that's going to allow us, as we've mentioned earlier, personalize things to the patient better. It's going to reduce costs. I think as drugs and stuff become more and more expensive, insurance companies are going to require that more and more. They are also now requiring tests that tell you if the drug is working. They're called companion diagnostics because they don't want to be paying for a drug if it's not actually helping the situation. All these kinds of things. And so we need to get better at figuring out what people have, not just better at treating what they have. And this is going to be a huge part of it. And looping back, this is where AI is going to be huge as well. Because imagine going to the doctor 5 years from now, and on your health record, it's got your entire genome. It's got every lab test you've ever run. It's got and it's got this information on every person in the United States, right?
Right.
Imagine what an AI model could do with that kind of information and history on every single person. I know doctors who get really good at diagnosing certain diseases because they see them a lot, right? They get to the point where they can just look at someone and say, "Oh, I know what you have." AI could do that for they would be equivalent to a doctor with 1,000 years of experience, right? And has seen 1 million patients. And be able to bring all that disparate kind of information together and make an accurate diagnosis from that. Now, to get there, a couple of things we need those electronic health records to be complete and systematically kept. And, people familiar with AI know that often you spend most of your time cleaning up the data that goes into it. And the other thing I think we need is we need better diagnostics as the data that AI is using in that, right? And that's where we as a field need to focus is how do we get those data points for these complex algorithms to be able to diagnose individuals. And that's different than what we're used to. Right now, we want diagnostics that give you a clear-cut yes or no, they have this disease. And in most diseases, that's not what it's about. It's a complex convergence of different factors: genetic background, environmental exposure, location where you live, socioeconomic status. All of these things are predictive, and you got to bring them all together, which means as from a diagnostic point of view, we got to get to a point where we are just looking to create data points rather than clear-cut single data point answers.
Yeah, a lot of ideas in that previous point. I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole. Also, looking at the time, I mean, you're talking about this AI super doctor, which I think is. I mean, I've heard that a couple times, and it's fascinating, really. But I guess there's always the good and the bad, and the rabbit hole is, of course, privacy issues, which everybody needs to talk about, and all the negative repercussions that go along with it. I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole. Maybe you have like one comment or so on that, because I know that there are people listening that are going to be like, well, what about the data privacy? And, maybe just spend 1 minute talking about that, and then we can jump into some other things.
Yeah, I think data privacy is an interesting issue and something we've got to figure out. However, that said, AI do not think is a big threat to data privacy because it's not looking at individuals. It's looking at large patterns across the data, right? And so there's ways to anonymize these medical records, give it just the data points. It doesn't have to give name and birth date and, personal information. And even if that is used to train an AI model, that's not the data point you would get out at the end, right? There's nothing identifiable about that. If I have an AI that can identify a cyclist for a driving car, there's no way to go back and figure out what individual riding a bike trained that model and expose their identity from that, right? It's fundamentally anonymized. And so I think it's less of a concern than many people think. And again, I think it's because as humans, we tend to think about it as, I'm going to look at these individuals and build a pattern, when AI doesn't care. It's just going to get millions of individuals and look for patterns that are generalizable across the population, not be concerned with exposing the identity of a certain person. So I guess that's my big thought on that one. We do need to protect it. It is important. But again, training models are anonymous. You don't have to worry about it.
Fair enough. Yeah. And I actually have spent a couple podcasts just focusing on, cybersecurity and data privacy and things. So we don't need to go down this rabbit hole here. One of the other points that I wanted to bring up with this, future, and hopefully it happens within our lifetimes, most probably will, about this, whether you want to call it a super AI doctor or whatever. The one thing that keeps coming up in the podcast episodes when we're talking about these different emerging technologies is the distributed nature of some AI super doctor, right? Where right now, say, I have something wrong with me, I need to go to a doctor, and if there's a specialist that's needed, well, maybe I need to wait a month. I'm in Canada, so maybe it'll be a year or 2 years before I can see that specialist, right? And with this alternative future that we're moving into, it's very much, it'll be on the cell phone, take a picture, and I'm able to get, probably a pretty good diagnosis, if not better than what I would even get now, waiting 1 to 2 years for a specialist. Have you and your colleagues and your peers been talking about like how that is going to, well, one, I guess, impact jobs in the healthcare industry, and two, kind of, I don't know, like bring about a tremendous boom that we've never really seen before in civilization, because people are just able to get, well, diagnosed and then have a cure kind of in one sitting and move along with their life and not have to deal with, whether it's cancer or, a sore foot or whatever it is. Like, I mean, these are pretty substantial ideas when you really sit down and start thinking about them.
They are, and they're hard to predict what the impacts will be. I think the first impact, though, is a great improvement. At least for a long time, I actually think a doctor's still involved. They still have an intuition to provide. They have a human component. The computer may be a tool, a help for them, but you still need the doctor. And what I hope happens is that doctor becomes more efficient, and his allocation of time and resources is better done, such that maybe you don't have to wait 1 to 2 years anymore.
Yes.
Right? Canada is always talking about shortage of doctors. The US, even without kind of a strong national healthcare system, is always talking about shortages of doctors, these kinds of things. So I think the first thing that happens is not that the doctors all get laid off, but they are more effective now. They're more productive in such a way that healthcare costs go down and accessibility goes up.
Yeah.
And that would be the big thing. And then, of course, the accuracy of the diagnostics and the treatment plans improves as well. But there's still that human touch, and you still need to have that kind of connection with the person to convince them that they have to do the training plan, or to realize, that the computer may say that's the best one, but talking with this individual, that's not realistic in this particular case, things like that.
Right.
And there'll still be a key part for them to play there.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, with our time winding down here a little bit, we've touched on kind of where the future might go. Are there I mean, there's always substantial challenges to making a future like this come about. Are there any, I mean, maybe the question is, are there any substantial challenges that you are dealing with your lab? And then maybe you can tie that into like larger challenges that this whole fundamental movement in healthcare is going to be taking care of or dealing with over the next couple of years?
I don't know if there's huge, particular challenges. We, in the healthcare space, we all have regulatory challenges.
Yeah.
And many of those are good, and some of those are not efficiently implemented, et cetera, right? That's all.
Yeah.
That's all typical, and it's always going to be there. And we don't consider that a particular challenge. It's just cost of doing business.
Yeah.
So we'll go through those. And, in a sense, my personal opinion, having a check is good as long as we're doing that check efficiently and not arbitrarily, et cetera, right? I think the biggest thing is just time and resources. And then, the bigger picture ideas we've talked about will depend on some paradigm shifts that we're struggling with as a field right now. For example, we as a company, we do DNA sequencing. Cancer DNA sequencing is a big area right now. So we have a partner company we've been working with saying, hey, move over to our sequencing technology. We can get you the information you've been getting and more, because we're third generation. And they sent us a data set and we sequenced it. And I said, well, send us what the other provider had sent, right? And the other provider had cherry picked 5 mutations out of the entire genome that were already known to have a significant effect on that particular type of cancer. And they threw out the rest of the data. And we kept thinking to ourselves, well, you just threw out all the data that could teach you something new, right? But because of liability concerns and regulatory concerns, they wanted to stick to the known safe stuff.
Right.
And at some point, I think we have to be able to say, here's the known safe stuff and here's the other stuff, so that we can use that to train AI models or to discover new mechanisms of drug resistance or whatever in it. And that's just going to take a paradigm shift in the field. And in fact, that and other paradigm shifts in the field, thinking about things differently than we have in the past, probably I would say is our biggest hurdle that we have. Big data type mentality is very, very different than anything we've ever done as a human species.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
And it's going to take some time for us to get used to that way of thinking.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast, Jonathon. Thanks a lot for coming on. Really appreciate your time and insights on there. Certainly got me rethinking about the future of healthcare. I mentioned before, it's definitely want to have more people like you come onto the podcast to talk about this stuff. It's really fascinating. I'll have your LinkedIn and website of your lab up on the show notes. Are there any other places that you're, active on or want people to reach out to you from?
LinkedIn and the website are the 2 best ways to get a hold of us.
Perfect.
For people thinking of, hey, how can I get involved in the kind of research, et cetera, there is a contact us on the website, and we're happy to partner with you or see what we can do together.
Terrific. Well, again, thank you very much, Jonathon. I know that people listening will get some benefit, and if they're anything like me, their mind will start sparking new ideas. So thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. It's been a fun chat.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.